In the quiet dawn of the medieval world, Europe lay wrapped in fog and fear, where narrow dirt roads cut through frozen fields and wooden villages. Huddled beneath the shadow of stone churches, bells rang not for celebration but for warning hunger. War and prayer ruled daily life. Men rose before sunlight, pulling heavy wool, cloaks tight against the cold, while women baked coarse bread over smoking hearths, filling the air with ash sweat, and hoped this was a world where disease traveled faster than mercy, where a bad harvest meant death, and where every storm felt like a message from God watching from the sky far beyond these lands. Across deserts and seas stood Jerusalem, a city carved from dust, stone, and belief sacred beyond measure. To Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, its streets echoed with prayer, incense, and market voices, and for centuries, pilgrims crossed continents to reach its holy ground, seeking forgiveness and salvation. Yet power shifted as empires rose and fell, and the Holy Land came under Muslim rule. While many pilgrims still traveled, stories returning west grew darker. Tales of danger of sacred churches, threatened of humiliations suffered by the faithful, whether truth or fear these whispers ignited. Something deep inside medieval Europe, inside cold monasteries and vast Roman halls, the church saw a divided, violent continent, where knights slaughtered neighbors and kings fought endlessly. Faith was strong but uncontrolled, and in 1095, under a gray winter sky, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd at Claremont. Torches flickered, breath hung heavy in the air, and his voice carried across stone and silence. He spoke of Jerusalem, of suffering Christians, of a holy duty that promised salvation through sacrifice, sins erased through sacred war. The crowd erupted as one deus vult. God wills it. A cry that shook the earth in that moment. Desperation, faith, ambition, and fear fused into destiny. Peasants who owned nothing stitched red crosses onto rough cloth. Nobles sold land, armor, and castles. Men who had never seen the sea pledged to cross it toward a land they barely understood. The Crusades were not born from maps or strategy, but from belief, from hunger for meaning, from a world clinging to heaven while walking through darkness. As the call to holy war spread across Europe, the roads themselves seemed to awaken, filled with movement and noise as thousands left their homes behind, entire villages emptying into history. Nobles rode beneath fluttering banners while peasants walked barefoot, carrying little more than faith and hunger. Iron rang as blacksmiths forged swords and horseshoes, sparks flying into smoky air. Churches overflowed with prayer as crosses were stitched onto cloaks, stained with sweat and hope. These armies were not unified, disciplined forces, but vast rivers of humanity, flowing eastward through forests, mountains, and foreign cities. Winter winds cut through armor, rain turned roads into rivers of mud, and disease followed closely behind. Hunger gnawed constantly, and many never reached the battlefield, dying instead along nameless roads buried without prayer. Yet belief pushed them forward across the Byzantine Empire, whose golden domes and marble streets stunned Western eyes. Constantinople shimmered with wealth, knowledge, and ancient order, a sharp contrast to the rough world they had left behind. Emperors watched nervously as these uncontrolled armies passed through, both allies and threats, bound by uneasy promises. From there the journey turned brutal, crossing into Anatolia, where sun-scorched plains replaced green fields, and Seljuk Turkish forces struck like shadows. Swift and deadly battles erupted amid dust, and screams steel clashed against steel. Arrows darkened skies, and blood soaked dry earth. The Crusaders learned quickly that faith alone could not stop hunger, heat, or skilled enemies. Victories were rare, and costly defeats devastating as the march continued. Cities rose like mirages, Antioch, towering with walls and towers, became a test of endurance. Siege engines groaned as they hurled stones, starving men, boiled leather, and ate rats. Desperation blurred, morality, betrayal whispered through camps, and when the city finally fell, violence exploded, unchecked. Streets ran red as torches lit screams that echoed into the night. Yet even this horror was framed as divine justice, belief numbed, conscience, and justified cruelty driven onward. By prophecy and promise, the Crusaders marched south through scorched lands toward Jerusalem, weakened but relentless barefoot pilgrims. Now hardened by death, sun, and blood, when at last the holy city appeared on the horizon, rising pale beneath a burning sky, many wept, fell to their knees, and kissed the ground. Years of suffering narrowed into a single vision. Redemption seemed within reach, yet what awaited inside? Those walls would stain history forever. The crusade had transformed ordinary men into instruments of faith and fury, and the line between salvation and savagery had vanished completely when Jerusalem finally fell in the summer heat of 1099. The city did not receive its conquerors in silence, but in screams, fire, and chaos. Stone streets echoed with the clash of iron and the roar of men convinced they were fulfilling divine will as crusaders surged through gates, towers, and narrow alleys. Exhaustion vanished, replaced by frenzy. Houses, mosques, and synagogues became killing grounds, and the air, filled with smoke, blood, and prayer, spoken in terror and triumph. Alike chroniclers would later struggle to describe the scale of violence, yet within the minds of the victors, this was not massacre, but purification, a sacred act sealing years of suffering with victory after the blood dried. The cross was raised above holy sites, and Latin kingdoms were carved from conquered land. Fragile states, surrounded by hostile powers, castles rose quickly, their walls thick and pale against desert sun, while churches replaced older shrines, and European lords ruled foreign soil through fear, fortification, and faith. But these new kingdoms were never secure. Supply lines stretched thin across seas. Disease, hunger, and constant attack drained them, and the Muslim world, once divided, began to awaken. Leaders rose who understood that unity was survival. Among them stood Saladin, a man shaped by discipline, strategy, and belief rather than rage. His rise marked a turning tide. Armies reformed tactics, sharpened in holy war, now burned from both sides. In 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, Crusader forces weakened by thirst, heat, and arrogance were crushed. Beneath the sun, banners fell, relics were captured, and Jerusalem once more changed hands, yet this time the city was spared. Large scale slaughter, mercy itself became a weapon, a contrast that echoed across history. News of the loss sent shockwaves back to Europe. Church bells rang in mourning and rage. Kings answered the call again, among them Richard the Lionheart, whose arrival brought renewed bloodshed, thundered charges, and legendary duels. The Third Crusade turned the eastern coast into a battlefield of steel waves and siege engines. Yet even with victories, Jerusalem remained out of reach, and compromise replaced Congress. Time marched on, and crusades continued, driven less by faith and more by power, greed, and politics, until one final wound shattered all illusion when crusaders turned on Constantinople itself in 1204, looting, burning, and breaking the greatest Christian city in the world. The crusading ideal collapsed under its own violence, revealing a truth too heavy to ignore. The wars meant to save souls had instead reshaped empires, deepened hatred, and forever scarred the memory of the medieval world. As centuries passed and the fires of the Crusades slowly dimmed, their echoes did not fade but settled deep into the bones of history, shaping borders, beliefs, and bitterness long after The swords were laid down, the Latin kingdoms in the east eventually crumbled one by one, swallowed by stronger unified powers, while Europe returned home, changed veterans, carried scars, stories, and a hardened view of the world monasteries recorded. Battles beside prayers and maps were redrawn with distant lands, now imagined as reachable and conquerable trade routes, opened across the Mediterranean. Spices, silk, and knowledge flowed alongside suspicion and rivalry, bringing new wealth to Italian ports and new ideas into European minds. Medicine, mathematics, and philosophy crossed cultural lines, even as hatred remained. Technology evolved. Siege engines, armor, navigation, and fortification advanced, rapidly fueled by generations of war castles. Grew thicker walls, cities more complex, and kings stronger. Central authority rising from the chaos that churns. Church gained power, then lost moral ground as the reality of crusading violence clashed with spiritual promise. Faith itself began to shift slowly. Questioned by those who had seen blood spilled in God's name in the Islamic world, memories of invasion forged unity, resilience, and historical consciousness. Heroes like Saladin became symbols of honor and resistance, shaping identity for centuries. The Crusades also hardened divisions between religions, turning shared sacred spaces into contested scars. Mistrust replaced coexistence, and stories passed through generations, each shaped by loss, victory, and fear. These wars were never simply about land or faith. They were collisions of worlds driven by human longing, insecurity, and ambition. The idea of holy war left a dangerous legacy, proving how belief, when fused with power, can justify unimaginable cruelty. Yet the Crusades also revealed unexpected truths that cultures once locked in violence could still exchange: knowledge, art, and science that even in war humanity learned from its enemies. In the quiet aftermath, ruined castles sank into hills, deserts reclaimed fortresses, and battlefields returned to silence. But memory remained, shaping modern conflicts, language, and identity. Even today, the word crusade still carries weight, echoing with righteousness and warning. The medieval world believed it was marching toward salvation, but instead it forged a lesson written in blood and stone, that faiths without humility becomes a weapon, and that history does not end when wars do. It lives on in the stories we inherit and the choices we repeating. The fading light of the medieval world as the last echoes of crusading armies disappeared beyond memory. The true meaning of the Crusades remained unfinished, lingering like smoke in the halls of history. These wars were not a single story of heroes or villains, but a mirror reflecting humanity at its most devoted and most destructive. Generations had marched believing heaven watched every step, yet what survived was not divine victory, but transformation. Europe emerged, altered its horizons, expanded its confidence, sharpened its hunger for exploration and conquest. The idea that distant lands could be reached, fought over, and ruled planted seeds that would later grow into empires. Ships built for crusading supply lines evolved into vessels of discovery, carrying sailors toward unknown oceans and continents, while castles once meant to guard holy ground inspired military architecture across kingdoms. The crusading mindset reshaped power, teaching rulers how to mobilize belief for control and unity, but also revealing the cost. When faith is weaponized, the church, which once commanded armies, slowly faced doubt as people remembered promises of salvation. Weighed against rivers of blood, the sacred and the political could no longer be fully separated, and cracks appeared that would later widen into reform and rebellion. In the Middle East, the memory of invasion became a foundation of identity shaping resistance, leadership, and unity. For centuries, stories of defense, honor, and survival passed through generations, reinforcing a sense of shared history that still resonates today. The Crusades also hardened the language of us and them, turning religious Difference into inherited mistrust, yet beneath the violence another truth quietly survived. Cultures exchanged more than blows. Science, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy crossed borders carried by traders, scholars, and captives, proving that even enemies learn from one another. The medieval world believed the Crusades were about saving souls, but history reveals they were about fear, ambition, devotion, and power, woven together in human hands as time buried swords beneath soil and stone. These wars became caution rather than command, reminders of how easily belief can ignite conflict and how long its consequences endure. The Crusades did not end in victory or defeat, they ended in legacy, a legacy carved into borders, faiths, and memories that still shape modern conflicts, language, and identity. When we look back across torchlit roads and blood-stained walls, we see not just medieval warriors but ourselves struggling with the same questions of meaning, loyalty, and belief. The Crusades stand as a warning written across centuries that when certainty replaces compassion, the cost is paid not only by the defeated but by the world that follows.